It was a calm Saturday morning, the kind of day when the air feels fresh and the sun peeks gently through the clouds. The local shooting range was already buzzing with activity. People were chatting, cleaning their guns, and preparing for a day of target practice. Among the familiar faces of regular shooters, a new figure appeared at the entrance. She was a black woman, dressed simply in faded jeans, a plain shirt, and a worn-out jacket. Her shoes were dusty, and in her hand she carried an old rifle case that looked as if it had been through many years of use. Her name was Clara Johnson, but no one there knew her yet. She walked slowly, almost quietly, as if she didn't want to disturb anyone. Her steps were steady, and her face showed no sign of excitement or nervousness. She had the kind of calm presence that made people notice her without her even trying. Some of the shooters glanced up from their gear and gave her quick looks. They didn't recognize her, and in a place where most people knew each other, strangers stood out immediately. Clara didn't rush. She moved through the range with quiet confidence, heading towards an empty lane. But the way she looked, humble clothes, no fancy gear, an old rifle case, made a few people exchange amused smiles. They thought she was probably new to shooting, maybe someone trying it for the first time. To them, she didn't look like a professional or even a hobbyist who knew much about guns. As she reached her lane, she set down her case gently on the table. The sound of other shooters' laughter and talking carried through the air. Clara didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she didn't care. She was focused only on the task in front of her. Her hands, though calm, had a quiet strength as she began to unzip the rifle case. The shooting range had its own culture, and newcomers were often tested not officially, but through the looks, the whispers, and sometimes the subtle mockery. Clara could feel the eyes on her, but she didn't react. She kept her head slightly lowered, her attention fixed on her own space. There was something almost mysterious about her. She wasn't there to impress anyone, and she certainly wasn't there to seek attention. The air smelled faintly of gunpowder and oil. The sound of bullets hitting targets echoed in sharp, rhythmic bursts. Clara's old rifle case looked out of place among the shiny, expensive gear owned by the regulars. Some people polished their scopes and adjusted their custom grips, while Clara simply stood quietly, almost blending into the background till you looked closer. There was a stillness about her, the kind that comes before something important happens. Her eyes, deep and steady, scanned the target in the distance before she even took out her weapon. It was as if she was already measuring the shot in her mind. She didn't fidget. She didn't rush. Every move was deliberate, slow, and precise. Man a few lanes down nudged his friend and nodded in Clara's direction. They smirked, their expressions saying, "This should be interesting." Another man nearby leaned on the divider, pretending not to watch, but clearly curious. The unspoken assumption was the same. This quiet woman, with her old gear and unremarkable appearance, would likely miss the target or handle the rifle awkwardly. But Clara's expression never changed. If she heard the low chuckles, she ignored them. She placed her bag to the side, took a deep breath, and slowly opened the rifle case. Inside was a weapon that, despite its worn exterior, was well cared for. The barrel gleamed faintly, the metal parts free of rust or dirt. It was a tool that had seen years of use, and every inch of it had been maintained with care. She ran her hand along the stock briefly, almost like greeting an old friend. Then she began assembling her setup with quiet focus. She adjusted the stand, checked the scope, and positioned herself at the lane. Around her, the noise of other shooters seemed to fade, as if she carried her own bubble of concentration. In that moment, Clara was like a shadow moving through sunlight, noticed by most, underestimated by those who did notice. And yet, there was an invisible tension in the air. A sense that something was about to happen that no one in the room was prepared for. Clara wasn't thinking about the people watching her. she wasn't thinking about proving anyone wrong. She was simply doing what she had done countless times before. Prepare, focus, and be ready. The old rifle in her hands wasn't just a piece of metal and wood. It was part of her story, a part no one here knew yet, while others saw a simple woman stepping up to try her luck at shooting. Clara knew the truth. She had walked into places far more dangerous than this range. She had faced moments where a single breath, a single movement, determined life or death. But today, here, in this quiet building filled with laughter and whispers, she would let her skills speak for themselves. By the time she finished setting up, the mockers were still smiling, still certain of the show they thought they were about to get. What they didn't realize was that the show was indeed about to begin, just not the one they expected. Clara's calm hands and steady breathing were the silent signals that the game was already over before it started. The moment her finger would touch the trigger, their laughter would vanish. But for now, in this peaceful, almost still moment, Clara simply stood there, quiet, underestimated, and entirely ready. Asterisk, the murmurs began almost the moment Clara unzipped her rifle case. They were soft at first, just a couple of whispers between the regulars. But as more people noticed her, the low hum of conversation spread. It wasn't the friendly chatter you hear when someone new walks in. It was the kind that carries a sharp edge, hidden behind half smiles and raised eyebrows. Two men leaning against a wall by the vending machine were the first to chuckle. "Look at that," one said under his breath. "She's got an antique. Bet she's never even fired it." His friend smirked, sipping from a paper cup of coffee. "Maybe she's here for a class or something. Hope she brought earplugs." Farther down the range, a younger man in a bright red cap tilted his head to watch her. He gave a slow shake of his head, grinning as he spoke to the guy next to him. $5 says she can't hit the paper, let alone the bullseye." The other man laughed and held up his hand for a mock handshake. "Make it 10. Clara heard them. She didn't have to strain. Their voices weren't as quiet as they thought, but her face didn't change. Not a single muscle twitched. She'd learned long ago that reacting to provocation was a waste of energy. In her line of work, her old line of work, silence was often the sharpest weapon. Still, the laughter continued, and each little remark grew bolder. A man passing behind her lane looked at her setup and said loudly enough for half the room to hear, "Careful, sweetheart. Don't point that thing the wrong way." His friends erupted in laughter. Clara simply tightened the adjustment on her scope, her eyes never leaving the distant paper target. The shooting range had seen its share of new shooters, teenagers brought by their parents, tourists curious to try something different, even corporate team-building events, and it was almost a tradition among some regulars to tease the newcomers. But there was something different about the way they teased Clara. It wasn't just about being new, it was the way she looked, the way she carried herself. And, though no one said it out loud, the fact that she didn't fit their idea of who belonged in that space. The truth was, Clara knew exactly what they saw when they looked at her. They saw a simple black woman, maybe someone's grandmother, maybe someone who worked at a grocery store or a library, dressed in clothes that didn't scream marksman or military. They saw someone who didn't seem like a threat in any way. And that suited her just fine. She placed a magazine of rounds neatly beside her, each bullet lined up in perfect order. Her hands were steady, and there was no hesitation in her movements. If anyone had been paying close attention, not just glancing between jokes, they might have noticed the subtle signs of someone who knew what they were doing. But most weren't. Watching closely, they were too busy expecting a show they thought would be funny. One man, older than the rest, sat a few lanes away cleaning his revolver. He'd been coming to the range for decades and had seen just about every kind of shooter walk through the door. His eyes lingered on Clara for a moment, and something about the way she adjusted her stance made him pause. He didn't join in the laughter. Instead, he just kept watching, quietly. The mocking voices blended with the sounds of the range gun shots in steady bursts. The metallic click of magazines loading, the faint hum of the ventilation system pulling away smoke. Clara stayed locked in her rhythm, adjusting her breathing, her stance, the angle of her elbows. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her back. But she didn't let it reach her mind. "Hey, sweetheart, want me to show you how it's done?" A voice called from 2 lanes over. The man grinned, leaning his elbow on the divider as if he were doing her a favor. Clara didn't look at him. She slid the first round into the chamber with a soft, deliberate click, her fingers moving with practiced ease. The smirks and chuckles were a familiar soundtrack, one she'd heard in many forms before. In basic training, on deployment, even in situations far from home where the stakes were life and death. People who underestimated her had a way of learning quickly how wrong they were. And here, in this small shooting range, the lesson was about to be taught again. The red-capped man whispered to his friend, "Watch this. She's probably gonna flinch at the recoil." They both leaned forward slightly, ready to enjoy the moment they thought was coming. Clara inhaled deeply, her chest rising slowly. She exhaled with equal control, letting the air leave her lungs in a steady stream. Her finger hovered over the trigger, not yet pressing, but ready. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus so sharp that the rest of the room seemed to fade away. The mocking had reached its peak. There was nothing more for them to say. Now they just waited for the laugh they expected. Clara, however, wasn't thinking about them at all anymore. She was thinking about wind, about the weight of her rifle, about the exact point where the front sight would align perfectly with the center of the target. She didn't see the men leaning in to watch. She didn't hear the coffee cup being set down in anticipation. She didn't care about the old jokes, the patronizing offers to help, or the way some eyes looked at her as if she didn't belong. All she saw was the target. All she felt was the rifle in her hands. All she knew was that the moment to shoot was coming soon. And when it came, the laughter would end. The moment had stretched so long it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Clara stood in her lane, her body still, her eyes locked on the distant target as if nothing else in the world existed. Around her, the usual range noises carried on, shots popping, shells clinking against concrete, the faint whir of the ventilation fans, but in her mind, it was silent. Completely silent. Her hands were steady on the rifle. The butt of the stock was snug against her shoulder, her cheek resting lightly against it, her right eye lined perfectly with the scope. Through the glass, the paper target didn't look like a flat sheet 30 yards away, looked like it was right in front of her. Each ring sharp and crisp, the bullseye glowing faintly in the center of her vision. She inhaled deeply, letting her ribs expand slowly, and then release the breath in a long, even stream. She had done this motion thousands of times in her life, but each time it felt like the first. Precision, she had learned, was not in the shot itself, was in everything that happened before the shot. Behind her, the red-capped man leaned forward, elbows on the divider. His friend had already pulled out his phone to record, his grin wide with anticipation. A couple more onlookers had noticed and subtly shifted so they could watch. They weren't expecting skill. They were expecting a flinch, a miss, maybe even a small embarrassment they could talk about later. Clara's finger rested gently on the trigger. She didn't squeeze yet. She waited. Timing was everything. She was aware of the smallest things. The faint shift of air from the overhead fan, the exact weight of the rifle in her grip, the position of her feet pressing firmly into the ground. Her heart rate slowed. Her muscles loosened but held their form, and then she squeezed. The crack of the rifle split the air, sharp and clean. The recoil was a gentle push into her shoulder. Nothing she wasn't used to. Through the scope, she saw the bullet punch into the exact center of the bullseye. Not near the center, not close enough. Dead center. For a half second, no one moved. The sound of her shot seemed to hang in the air, even as it was followed by the faint rip of paper from the impact. Then someone gave a low whistle. She chambered the next round without looking up, her movements smooth and quick. The brass casing clinked onto the table beside her. Her breathing never changed. She aligned the scope again, her finger ready. Crack, another perfect hit directly through the same hole as before. The red-capped man's smirk faltered. His friend lowered the phone slightly, eyes narrowing in disbelief. One of the men, who had been laughing earlier, stopped mid-sentence. The older man cleaning his revolver gave the faintest nod, as if he had already known this would happen. Clara didn't pause. She fired again, the sound echoing in the enclosed space. Another bullseye. Then another. And another. Each shot landed exactly where the last one had, the group of holes in the target so tight. It looked like the paper had been burned through by a single bullet. The laughter in the room had stopped completely. Now there was only the sound of gunfire, hers. And the others. But the others felt muted somehow, as if hers had claimed the space. Every time she fired, heads turned. Conversations went quiet. The rhythm of the range shifted to match her cadence. When her magazine emptied, she placed the rifle gently on the stand and reached for another. The metallic click of bullets being loaded was almost hypnotic now, drawing eyes back to her lane. The mockery had turned into murmurs this time, not with sarcasm, but with surprise. "Who is she?" Someone whispered near the back. "I don't know," came the reply, "but that's not beginner stuff." Clara still didn't look at them. She wasn't here for recognition. She wasn't here to prove anything. Shooting was something she understood in her bones, a skill built from years of discipline, repetition, and necessity. The second magazine slid into place. She positioned herself again, taking that same slow breath in, slow breath out. This time, a few people actually stopped shooting just to watch. The red-capped man had stepped back, arms folded, no longer smiling. His friend wasn't recording anymore. He was staring, brow furrowed, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Crack, bullseye. Crack, bullseye, crack. Bullseye.by. The time she lowered the rifle and set it down, her target was a shredded circle of paper, where the bullseye used to be. Not one shot had landed outside the center ring. She didn't rush to check her work. She didn't need to. She already knew exactly where every bullet had gone. Instead, she began unloading the rifle, moving with the same calm patience she'd had since she arrived. The room was different now. The air felt heavier, as if everyone was carrying the same unspoken thought. They had underestimated her badly. But Clara didn't smile or gloat. She didn't turn to meet their eyes. She just placed the empty magazine back in her bag, zipped up the case, and prepared for the next round. She had no interest in their shock. For her, this was just another day, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the range was quiet, not because the shooting had stopped, but because every single person in that room was still processing what they'd just seen. The silence after her last shot lingered, wrapping itself around the shooting range like a heavy blanket. It wasn't the comfortable silence of focus, it was the kind that follows a moment no one expected. The kind where everyone is trying to piece together what they just witnessed. Clara stood there, calm as ever, unloading her rifle with the same patient care she had shown in setting it up. Her movements were deliberate, each step in perfect order, as if she was following an invisible checklist only she could see. The regulars at the range had stopped talking about her now. Instead, they exchanged glances, some curious, some impressed, and some with a faint edge of embarrassment. The red-capped man, who had been leaning forward eagerly before her first shot, now stood back with his arms crossed, watching without a word. His friend, the one who'd been recording, slid his phone into his pocket. It wasn't funny anymore. Clara didn't look at any of them. She reached for a fresh magazine and began loading it slowly, her fingers moving with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Each bullet clicked into place with the soft, precise sound of Habita sound she'd heard thousands of times before. Not just in shooting ranges, but in places far less forgiving. For a brief moment, as her eyes rested on the rifle in her hands, her mind drifted not far enough to lose focus, but far enough to remember. She was no longer in the clean, fluorescent lit range. She was back in a dusty, sun-scorched landscape halfway across the world. The air was thick with heat, the kind that made the horizon shimmer. She remembered lying prone on a rocky hill, her rifle balanced on a makeshift rest, her cheek pressed to the stock. In her ears, the faint hiss of the wind was her only companion. Somewhere far below, through the shimmering heat, she could see movement, tiny, almost invisible to the untrained eye. She slowed her breathing, adjusted for wind, and waited. Patience, she knew, was more dangerous than haste. A voice in her earpiece had whispered, "Target will be in range in 10 seconds." She had responded with a single word, "Copy." And when the moment came, her finger had moved exactly as it did now, smooth, controlled, certain. One shot, one result. Mission complete. The flash of memory passed, and Clara was back in the range. She blinked once, her face as unreadable as before. No one around her knew where her mind had just gone, or what the image of that distant sunlit hillside meant. The older man with the revolver still watched her closely. He had seen marksmen before, good ones and great ones, but something about the way Clara handled herself was different. There was no showmanship, no ego, not even visible pride in her skill. It was just a part of her. Like breathing, she stepped forward and took position again, placing the rifle against her shoulder. This time, she didn't need to check her scope as much. Her body knew where everything was, the weight, the balance, the exact pressure her hands needed to hold steady. When she fired the next series of shots, there was no hesitation. Each one landed exactly where she wanted it, punching through the same ragged center hole in the target until the paper around it began to tear. The groupings were so tight that the target stand itself started to shake slightly from the repeated impacts. A quiet murmur rose in the background. "She's not just good," someone whispered. "She's scary good." A man in the far lane muttered to himself, "That's Special Forces accuracy." His buddy looked at him and frowned. "What makes you think she's military?" The man shrugged. "I've seen it before. That control, that's not just practice. That's training." Clara ejected the magazine and set the rifle down again, wiping her hands lightly on her jacket. Her eyes flicked toward the target, not with satisfaction, but with the same critical glance she'd give any piece of work. It was good, but to her it was only doing what needed to be done. A few people were starting to piece together the puzzle in their heads. But no one had the full picture yet. And Clara wasn't about to give it to them. She packed the second magazine back into her bag and reached for a water bottle. As she unscrewed the cap, she could feel the shift in the room. The mockery had been replaced with quiet respect. She knew respect here was shallow. It came only after a display. She had lived long enough to know that real respect wasn't earned in a moment. It was earned over years, through actions no one saw. Her mind drifted again, uninvited, to another place and another day. Rain, this time cold, relentless, soaking through her uniform as she lay motionless in the mud. Hours had passed without movement, her rifle an extension of her own body. She remembered the sharp sting of water running into her eyes and the smell of wet earth. She had been waiting for one target, one chance. It had come without warning, and she had taken it without hesitation. When she returned from that mission, there had been no applause. No laughter turned to silence. Only the quiet acknowledgement of those who understood what it meant to be perfect. When it mattered most, the sound of someone clearing their throat brought her back to the present. One of the younger shooters had stepped a little closer to her lane. He looked like he wanted to say something, maybe ask for advice, maybe just express admiration, but when Clara glanced up at him, her calm, steady gaze made him pause. Instead, he gave a small nod and stepped back. Clara zipped her rifle case halfway, deciding she'd put in enough rounds for now. There would be time for more later. Right now, she was content to let the room sit with what they'd just seen, because the truth was, this was only a fraction of what she could do. And no one here, not even the ones starting to suspect her background, had any idea just how much she had seen, how much she had done, and why her hands never shook. No matter the situation. The range had settled into a strange kind of quiet. Rhythm. People were still shooting, still reloading, still going about their business. But every few minutes, eyes would drift back toward Clara's lane. She had become the unspoken center of the room without ever asking for it. Clara was packing away her second set of rounds when she noticed a shadow fall across her table. She looked up and found the red-capped man standing there. Up close, he looked taller, broader, and far less smug than before, but there was still a flicker of pride in his eyes. The kind that doesn't disappear easily. "That's some shooting," he said finally. His tone was casual, but there was a tightness in his jaw. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Clara took a sip from her water bottle and set it down. "Practice," she said simply, then turned back to organizing her gear. The man smirked. But it wasn't the confident smirk from earlier, it was the kind someone wears when they're trying to mask their curiosity. "Nah," he said, shaking his head. "That's not just practice. I've been coming here for years. You don't shoot like that without something else." He leaned slightly closer. "You, military." Her hands paused for a fraction of a second, but her face remained unreadable. "Something like that," she replied. That only seemed to fuel his interest. "Special Forces," he pressed. "I knew a guy who shot like that. He was a sniper in Afghanistan. Said it took him years to get that kind of grouping. Yours is tighter." Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed the zipper on her rifle case halfway and looked at him for the first time since he'd approached. Her gaze was steady, almost weightless, but there was something behind it. Quiet warning. "Sometimes it's better not to ask questions you don't want the answer to," she said softly. The red-capped man's smirk faltered. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another voice joined in. It was the older man, with the revolver, the one who had been silently watching her since she arrived. He stepped forward, speaking not to the red-capped man, but directly to Clara. "Not often I see someone with that kind of control," he said. His voice was deep, calm. "Not just on the trigger you're breathing, your stance, your patience. That's discipline." Clara gave a small nod, acknowledging the compliment without inviting more conversation. The older man glanced at her hands. "You've done this under pressure before," he said, more as a statement than a question. "Not here. Not on a clean, well-lit range. Somewhere rougher, dirtier." A ripple of curiosity spread among the nearby shooters. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't mocking. The red-capped man folded his arms. "So what is it, Army? Marines? CIA? You don't just walk in here," and he stopped himself, realizing he was starting to sound like the one being tested. Clara calmly placed her water bottle back into her bag. "Does it matter?" she asked. "I'm just here to shoot." "It matters to me," the red-capped man replied, his voice firmer now. Because if you've done what I think you've done, then I've been wasting my time thinking I was good. There was a faint smile in the corner of Clara's mouth, but it didn't reach her eyes. Skill isn't about comparing yourself to someone else. It's about being ready when it counts. The older man nodded slowly, as if he understood something. The others didn't. She's right, he said. And I think she's been ready more times than any of us could imagine. The room fell into another hush. The tension wasn't hostile, it was something heavier, like the weight of unspoken truths. A couple of younger shooters exchanged glances, clearly curious but hesitant to speak. Clara picked up her rifle case, the zipper now fully closed. She slung it over her shoulder and stepped back from the lane. "You all have a good afternoon," she said simply, turning toward the exit. But before she could take more than 2 steps, the red-capped man called out, "Hey, whatever it was you did before, were you the best?" She stopped. For a moment, she didn't move, and the room seemed to lean forward collectively, waiting for her answer. Then she turned her head just enough for her voice to carry. "I did what I had to do," she said, "and I never missed." With that, she walked out, the door swinging shut behind her. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then the younger man, in the far lane, let out a low whistle. "Never missed," he muttered. The older man picked up his revolver again, but his eyes stayed on the closed door. "Whoever she was," he said quietly, "she's still that." The red-capped man stared at the empty lane where Clara had stood, his earlier arrogance replaced with something else entirely, respect, and maybe a touch of envy. He knew he'd probably never see her again, but the image of her steady hands and perfect shots would stay with him for a long time. Outside, Clara walked toward her car, the cool air hitting her face. She didn't look back. She never did. Because some stories didn't need to be told, at least. Not to strangers. The sound of gravel crunching under her boots faded as Clara slid into the driver's seat of her old, dark blue sedan. She set the rifle case gently on the passenger seat, buckled up, and started the engine. The range shrank in her rearview mirror, disappearing behind a bend in the road. For a few miles, she drove in silence, the steady hum of the engine filling the space where thoughts could live. But as the sun dipped lower, streaking the sky with muted gold, her mind drifted not toward the range, not toward the men who had mocked her, but toward a place she hadn't allowed herself to visit in years. The smell came first. Dry earth, hot metal, and a faint trace of gun oil. Then the sound-muffled radio chatter, boots shifting on sandbags. The occasional pop of distant gunfire. She was back there. It was a small, nameless village tucked into the mountains, a place where stone houses clung to the hillsides and narrow paths twisted like snakes. Clara lay on her stomach on a rooftop that had been reinforced with sandbags. The heat was relentless, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. Her face was half hidden under a desert scarf, but her eyes were locked through the scope of her M2010 sniper rifle, scanning the streets below. Her earpiece crackled. "Eagle 2, this is command. Confirm target position." Clara's voice was calm, steady. "Target is on foot. 2 o'clock. 75 meters. Moving toward the market square." Through her scope, she tracked him, tall, lean, wearing civilian clothes, but moving with military precision. A ghost among villagers. The kind of man who carried death in his pocket and walked like he knew. No one could stop him. She had studied his face in photos for weeks. A known bomb maker responsible for the deaths of dozens, maybe hundreds. Every second he stayed alive meant more lives lost. "Eagle 2, you are cleared to engage." Repeat, "cleared to engage." Clara adjusted her position slightly, compensating for a faint breeze that whispered over the rooftops. Her finger found the trigger, resting there without pressure. She exhaled slowly. The world narrowed to the crosshairs and the space between her heartbeat. Then movement. A child ran into the street, chasing a battered soccer ball. The target glanced down, adjusted his path, and kept walking. Clara waited. Patience, she reminded herself. One wrong shot could mean disaster. The boy ran past, disappearing around a corner. The street was clear again. Clara's breathing slowed even more. Through the scope, she could see the faint lines on the man's weathered face. She could see the way his hand brushed the inside of his vest every few steps, like a man checking for reassurance that the thing he carried was still there. Tick. Her finger began to squeeze. Tick. The crosshairs steadied. Tick. The shot broke. The sound was sharp, but to her, it was only a muted thump. Through the scope, she saw the man drop instantly, his body folding into the dust without a cry. One shot, one life ended. One threat erased. Target down, Clara said into her mic. No collateral. The voice in her earpiece was quick. Businesslike? Copy that eagle, too. Extract immediately. She disassembled her rifle with practiced speed, her hands moving without thought. Her team would be waiting. They would disappear into the hills before anyone knew what had happened. As she slipped down from the rooftop, the village sounds swelled again, goats bleating, voices calling, the distant hum of a generator. To the people here, she was invisible. Just another shadow passing through. That mission had been one of dozens. Some had been harder, some had been longer. But every single one had ended the same way, with her walking away. Her target not. The memory faded, replaced again by the hum of her car's engine. Clara's hands tightened briefly on the steering wheel, then relaxed. She had learned long ago that the past doesn't stay buried. It waits, patient and silent, until something like today's range pulls it to the surface. People always wanted to know the same thing. Were you the best? She never answered that question directly. Not because she doubted the truth, but because best was just a word. In her world, words didn't matter. Results did. And her results had been flawless. The world at large didn't know her name. All medals had been pinned to her chest in public ceremonies. Her work had been quiet, unseen, uncelebrated, but in the places that mattered, her reputation was enough to make dangerous men hesitate. The car crested a hill, and the evening sun flared across her windshield. She squinted, her mind already shifting back to the present. The rifle case beside her was silent, but it carried the weight of everything she'd ever done. Every life she'd taken, every mission she'd completed without fail. And somewhere, deep inside, she knew this wasn't the last time she'd need to remind someone, whether at a shooting range or far away, that she wasn't to be underestimated. Because when it came to pulling the trigger, Clara Johnson didn't miss. The last streaks of daylight were fading by the time Clara pulled into the driveway of her small, one-story house on the edge of town. It was a quiet place, no neighbors close enough to peer over fences, no traffic except the occasional delivery truck. Just the way she liked it. She carried her rifle case inside, setting it down gently in the corner of her living room. The house was modest but orderly, every item in its place. A coffee mug sat on the counter from that morning, and the faint scent of lavender from the candle she'd burned the night before still lingered in the air. For most people, it was just a peaceful evening. But Clara's life had taught her that peace was fragile. Thin glass that could shatter with the slightest pressure. She was halfway through heating water for tea when she heard a car engine outside. Not the familiar rumble of her mail carrier or the neighbor's pickup. This one idled for a moment before shutting off. Clara froze, the kettle still in her hand. Visitors were rare here. Unannounced ones were rarer. Through the narrow gap in her curtains, she saw a dark SUV parked in front of her house. The windows were tinted, the paint clean but not shiny government issue. Or someone who wanted to look like it. A man stepped out. He wore a plain black jacket, dark jeans, and boots that were too polished for casual wear. He moved with a certain precision, not the casual gait of a salesman or a lost driver, but the deliberate, measured pace of someone trained to watch. Every angle, Clara set the kettle down quietly and walked to the door. She didn't open it, yet she just stood there, listening. The crunch of boots on gravel drew closer. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps, not hesitant, not aggressive, just deliberate. She opened the door halfway, keeping the frame between them. "Can I help you?" The man smiled faintly. It wasn't a warm smile, was the kind that said he already knew her answer. "Clara Johnson." "That depends who's asking." He nodded as if he expected that. "Name's Daniel. I work with. Let's call it a special branch. We've met people like you before." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "People like me. People who can make a 900-yard shot in crosswind and not blink," he said. "People who don't miss." She said nothing. Daniels glanced briefly at the rifle case in the corner behind her. "We've been keeping track, Clara. You've kept a low profile, but today, word got around." That little display at the range stirred up some memories for certain folks. Her grip tightened on the door. "If you came to offer me a job, I'm not interested." "This isn't a job offer," Daniel said, his voice low. "It's a warning." Something cold slid down her spine. "Go on. There's a man. He's been looking for you for years. Ex-mercenary, used to work in Eastern Europe. Calls himself Viktor Resnick. You crossed paths a long time ago. Maybe you remember, maybe you don't, but he remembers you. And now he knows you're here." Clara's mind flicked through old missions like pages in a file. The name sparked faint recognition, a shadowy figure tied to a botched arms deal she'd disrupted nearly a decade ago. She had taken out his second-in-command with a single shot before the man could detonate explosives in a crowded square. Resnick had escaped. Barely. Daniels continued. "He's got resources, Clara. He's patient. And he's already in the country." She exhaled slowly. "If he's coming, I'll be ready." "That's exactly what I'm worried about," Daniels said. "When you're ready, bad things happen to people. And I'm not sure the people in this town are ready for the storm that follows you." Clara almost smiled. "Then maybe you should tell them to keep their distance." Daniel studied her for a moment, then reached into his jacket. He pulled out a small envelope and held it out. "Inside is everything we have on Resnick's movements in the last month. Consider it a courtesy." She took it without looking inside. "One more thing," Daniel said, stepping back toward the SUV. "He's not coming alone. And if I were him, I'd start by finding you where you feel safest." The engine of the SUV roared to life, and within seconds it was gone, disappearing down the dark road. Clara stood in the doorway, the envelope in her hand, the quiet night air pressing in around her. Somewhere out there, a man she had beaten once was closing the distance between them. And she knew men like Resnick didn't come for second chances. They came for endings. She closed the door, locked it, and walked back to the rifle case. Her fingers traced the worn handle before she unzipped it halfway. The cold gleam of the barrel caught the light. It had been years since she'd been hunted. Years since she'd had to prepare for something more than paper targets. But as she began checking her rifle piece by piece, she realized something. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. And this time, she wasn't planning to wait for Resnick to find her. 2 nights after Daniel's visit, the quiet edge of town was no longer quiet. Clara knew it before she saw it, before she heard it. The air itself felt different, charged, restless, like the minutes before a storm breaks. She stood at her kitchen table, cleaning her rifle with a meticulous hand, when the faint crunch of tires on gravel reached her ears. She didn't need to check. She already knew. Viktor Resnick had arrived. The name alone carried weight in certain circles. A man without allegiance except to money, with a reputation for patience and brutality. The kind of man who didn't hire amateurs, and who never forgot a debt of blood. Clara finished snapping the rifle back together and slid it into her hands. She didn't turn off the lights. She wanted him to think she was exactly where he expected her to be. Through the narrow gap in her curtains, she saw them. 2 SUVs, no plates. 4 men climbed out, 3 in dark tactical gear, 1 in a long coat. Resnick, even in the dim light, she recognized him immediately. Taller than she remembered. His frame heavier, but his eyes cold, calculating, were the same. He scanned the house with the slow precision of a predator. Clara slipped to the back door, moving like a shadow. She had no intention of waiting for them to kick it in. Outside, the night wrapped around her, and the chill of late evening kissed her face. Her boots made no sound as she crossed the yard and slipped behind the shed. She knew every inch of this property, every angle, every line of sight from the shed's roof. She had a perfect view of the front yard. Resnick gestured too, his men sending one toward the back, the others toward the front porch. She steadied her breathing, resting the rifle against the roof's edge. The first man came into her scope, dark gear, suppressed rifle, moving low. Clara tracked him effortlessly. She didn't hesitate. Crack. 1 shot. 1 body hitting the grass. The others froze. Resnick barked something in Russian, his voice low but sharp. They fanned out, searching for her. She was already shifting position. The second man tried to circle wide through the bushes. Crack, down. Resnick now stood alone with 1 remaining guard. Both ducking behind the SUV. He was smart using the metal as cover, but not smart enough. Clara shifted her scope to the narrow space between the front tire and the ground. A sliver of movement. Crack. The third man collapsed, legs folding awkwardly beneath him. Now it was just Resnick. She could feel the years between them like a stretched wire taut, humming with the unfinished business of that day in the mountains. Resnick didn't run. Instead, he stood, slowly, deliberately. Stepping out from behind the SUV, his coat hung open, and in his right hand was a long-barreled pistol. "I knew it was you," he called into the night. His voice was deep, touched with a mocking warmth. "Only 1 person in the world shoots like that?" Clara stayed silent, her scope trained on his chest. "You took something from me," he continued, walking a slow arc toward the front of the house. "My second, my friend. You left me alive, and I swore that day I would return the favor." She spoke at last, her voice calm, steady. "I should have finished it then." Resnick's laugh was low, humorless. "And yet, here we are. You hiding in the dark, me in the open. What's stopping you?" Clara didn't answer with words. She shifted her aim to the space just above his right shoulder and squeezed the trigger. The bullet tore through the air and struck the wooden post inches from his head, splintering it in an instant. Resnick didn't flinch, but she saw the flicker in his eyes. He understood the message. She could have ended him right there, but Clara didn't want him dropping in an instant. She wanted him to understand the distance between them, not just in skill, but in control. Resnick moved toward the side of the house, keeping low now, searching for a way in. Clara descended silently from the shed and moved along the shadowed fence line. She could hear his footsteps, measured but impatient. When he reached the corner, she stepped out. They were less than 20 feet apart now, moonlight spilling across the yard. Face to face, Resnick said, his pistol steady. No scope, no hiding. Clara kept her rifle lowered, but ready. You think distance is what makes me dangerous. Resnick's smirk returned. I think you've been living off one lucky shot for years. In that moment, his weight shifted forward the smallest tell before a man squeezes a trigger. Clara's rifle came up faster than his pistol. Cracked, the round struck clean through his weapon hand. The pistol clattered to the dirt. Resnick staggered back, clutching the wound, his face twisting in pain and rage. You don't get to call me lucky, Clara said, stepping closer, her barrel trained on his chest. You're alive because I let you be alive. That mistake ends tonight. He tried to speak, but her second shot ended it. One clean hit. He dropped instantly, his body folding into the shadows. The silence that followed was complete. Heavy and final dot, Clara stood still for a moment, her breathing steady, listening for any movement. There was none. Resnick's storm had come and gone, leaving only stillness in its wake. She holstered her rifle and looked up at the sky. The moon hung cold and bright, indifferent to the lives ended beneath it. Back inside, she cleaned her weapon methodically, the way she always had. When she finished, she placed it back in its case and set it in the corner. Tomorrow, the world would go on as if nothing had happened. The people at the range would keep shooting, keep talking, never knowing that a war had just ended in the dark. And Clara Johnson once mocked, underestimated, doubted would keep living quietly. But now, there was no one left alive who would dare forget who she really was. Because she was still, and always would be, the most deadly sniper ever.